Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar presented by the Cornell University Migrations Initiative called Reimagining Citizenship, Prospects for Immigration Reform in the Biden Administration. I'm Steve Yale-Loehr. I teach immigration law at Cornell Law School. And I also direct the asylum clinic at the law school. I'm also a fellow at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm also a faculty fellow at the Cornell University Migration Initiative. The Cornell University Migration Initiative is hosting many speakers this semester, and this is the very first of what we call the Reimagining Citizenship speaker series. We're also hosting a new podcast called Migrations, A World on the Move. The first issue of that is out at any of your major podcasting sites, and we also have a film series. Overall, the Migrations Initiative at Cornell University is trying to synthesize migrations topics and research relating to migrations of plants, animals, or people across time and space. So it's a very ambitious project, and we're glad to do this webinar today to learn more about particularly immigration in the United States. If you want to learn more about the Migrations Initiative, just go to migrations.cornell.edu/learn. I'm really excited today to introduce our three panelists. Going from left to right on the screen, you see there Keri Talbot, who is a former chief counsel to Senator Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, who is one of the lead Hispanic negotiators on the big bill that we'll be talking about shortly. She's currently the Deputy Director at Immigration Hub, and she's a co-author of the Immigration Hub's Big Book, which offered many recommendations for the incoming Biden administration. Next on the screen is Doris Meissner, who is former commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and she's currently a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where she directs MPI's U.S. immigration policy work, including a project called Reimagining Immigration. And so this webinar today is very much in her bailiwick. Third, we have Jorge Lima, who's Senior Vice President of Policy at Americans for Prosperity, and also Vice President of Immigration at Stand Together, and a key figure on immigration reform from the advocacy. So thanks to all three of you for being here today. Let's jump right in and try to give the audience a sense of what we're going to be covering in the next 40 minutes or so before we turn over to Q&A. We do have some handouts that we'll mention on the last slide. They'll also appear in the chat toward the end of the hour, and that will give you some reference point for some of the things that we'll be talking about. We'll also have available a PDF of the slide deck for you. But in the next 40 minutes or so, we hope to cover several topics. First, we'll start with immigration before President Trump, because immigration was already a mess then. Then we'll briefly talk about immigration changes during the Trump administration. Then we'll spend most of the time talking about immigration changes in the Biden administration, both what has happened, what is likely to happen, and what may take longer to be achieved. Then I'll ask the panelists for some predictions as to what they think may occur in the next 100 days of the Biden administration. So with that as an overview, let's go to the next slide, and let's talk about immigration before Trump. Doris, you were commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. You and I remember all the efforts to get immigration reform passed, first in 1986, in IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, to legalize individuals and institute employer sanctions, and then in the Immigration Act of 1990, which changed our legal immigration laws. But certainly we have not been able to have comprehensive immigration reform since then. We've had lots of problems. Is there anything you want to sort of summarize in terms of the complexity of immigration law, even before we had President Trump?
Well, you're certainly right that we've had a long history of difficulties that we haven't been able to keep up with in our laws. The 1986 law, the 1990 law described as you have, but I think we have to also remember the 1996 law, which really was entirely an enforcement statute. and very much created additional barriers in our immigration system, as well as hardened penalties on many fronts. And that's really the most recent true legislation that we've had, so that we're basically running a system that was outlined in 1986, 1990, and 1996. Those were very different times and different labor markets. And so we have laws that are just not aligned with the markets and the realities on the ground. And what we find is that where high-skilled immigration is concerned, there are ways to come, but it's almost entirely through a temporary visa system, which has become very, very stretched beyond what people would typically accept as temporary. And low-skilled work has been coming about as a result of unauthorized immigration, which is one of the reasons that we are in so much difficulty when we talk about new legislation. We tried big bills to solve those things in 2006, 7, and 2013, but they all failed. So that's where we are today. And we are at a point where what happened over the last 4 years made things even more complicated on a system that already was outdated and needed attention.
And let's turn to the next slide and talk about that. Certainly, the Trump administration made immigration one of the key points of their efforts to stay in power. And Doris, the Migration Policy Institute, came out with a report listing over 400 changes that the Trump administration made. Lucas Gutentag did the Immigration Policy Project Tracker. He listed over 1,000 changes, many at the sub-regulatory level that the Trump administration made. And Keri, I know that you at the Immigration Hub came out with a big book of trying to reconcile how to change what the Trump administration did. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the changes that you saw during the Trump administration and what you hoped that the Immigration Hub might be able to rectify in the new administration.
Yeah, so the Immigration Hub, under leadership of Sornado Reynolds, put together a book of hundreds of pages of recommendations with over 100 advocacy groups. And really the recommendations range all the way from asylum to naturalization to deportation issues to addressing Black migrant issues. And so it really is important for the new administration to just move as quickly as possible. And I think they really are going to try their best. Of course, it's challenging in that the Trump White House really focused almost exclusively at times on immigration, or very heavily on immigration, whereas of course Biden needs to deal with COVID among other crises. But I am really hopeful, given the amount of attention they've put the last few weeks, that they'll be able to really get through many of these policies that need to be reversed and reformed.
Great. And let's go to the next slide about changes during the Trump administration. And Jorge, let's bring you into the discussion there. What were some of the major changes that you saw in your work during the Trump administration on immigration issues?
Yeah, I think to summarize kind of the biggest concern, Steve, was how the changes during the Trump administration were in sometimes specifically designed, and even if they were not, literally had the impact of dramatically reducing the amount of legal immigration that was coming into the country. And so to pick up on some of the themes that have been mentioned already, but particularly Doris's comments about how the immigration before Trump was already in a space that needed major reform. A large part of that is that the system hasn't been able to keep up with the level of legal immigration that the country wants to sustain. And so during the Trump administration, some of the areas that we were concerned about were those that continue to have this impact, that were limiting legal immigration into the country. And that's on top of the other ones that, of course, were impacting the families and communities along the border, driving confusion even amongst the current immigration population. And so all of that put an additional strain on the system, where even the ones that were accessing it and trying to navigate it now found it all the more complex. I think we learned a lot of the emphasis that the administration put on immigration, specifically through administrative channels, right? So there was very little that Congress did during the time of the Trump administration on immigration. And so all of this now to the point made earlier about how Biden's administration is going to start looking at kind of undoing or re-examining some of those. It's a hefty task because there was a lot that was done there. And the truth is we've got to find ways to, again, make I'll sum it up as this way. It can't just all be on the Biden administration. Yes, there's a lot for them to do. But a big part of the conflict and the issues we see today is the absence of Congress doing a lot on immigration. And that balance needs to be rectified so that we can start to address the overall reforms we truly want to see in immigration.
That's a good segue. Let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the changes that the Biden administration needs to take, both at congressional level and within the agency. And let's start just doing it topic by topic here. Let's talk first about, the southern border. There's a lot that has gone wrong at the southern border in terms of restrictions based on COVID, based on asylum eligibility. If asylum applicants went through a third country, for example, they were deemed not to be eligible to apply for asylum in the United States. Litigation is also another factor here. Many courts have held up some of the Trump administration's border restrictions. But Doris, let's start with you and talk about what you see as some of the key things that the Biden administration already has done regarding the southern border and what else it needs to do to bring back some semblance of order on that issue.
Well, the southern border, of course, has been a major preoccupation in the prior 4 years. Just remember the wall and the rallying around the wall, the incredible amounts of money that were put into it. The Biden administration has said not one more mile of wall and is now in the process of trying to unwind those wall building contracts. But the southern border, as we see already in the Biden administration, is a major issue that does not get fixed quickly. And the reason it can't get fixed quickly is filled with lots of factors. First of all, the asylum system at the southwest border basically was shut down by the prior administration, and shut down in ways that can't just be reversed quickly because they involve regulations, they involve decisions made by the Attorney General, guidance on how the legal interpretation of eligibility for asylum is to be understood by asylum officers and court judges. All of those things will take procedures to be done differently. And if they're not done properly, they will be immediately vulnerable to litigation and to being tied up in the courts. So the Biden administration is quite clear in understanding what's required. Its difficulty, of course, is that people in Central America, people in other parts of the world that have watched the United States do believe what Biden is saying, and that is that the U.S. should have more humane policies, more effective ways of dealing with our protection responsibilities. And so people will be and are beginning to come in advance of changes being able to be put into place. So that's a real dilemma for the Biden administration. But it also does connect very quickly to something that Jorge said, which is that this strain that we have on our asylum system has some degree, to some considerable extent, is connected to the fact that we don't have enough legal immigration pathways to come to the U.S. for work purposes. And so people who are trying to get here use the asylum system often inappropriately. So all of those things are challenges for the Biden administration to straighten out. The good news, of course, is that they recognize it and understand it and are committed to a system that is based on the rule of law and based on humane practices. That's a real change from what the prior 4 years.
And Keri, let me follow up on that with you. I mean, President Biden has gotten criticized for not moving fast enough on the southern border and, for example, keeping the Remain in Mexico policy intact for the time being, although he says he's going to review that, and having the COVID Title 42 restrictions in place. What is the immigration hub doing about advocating for changes on that front?
I think mostly we're just keeping in close contact to urge, the most clear communication possible to asylum seekers who have been waiting for quite a long time in Mexico in camps. We really want people to be able to understand, exactly what the process will be and how they can apply. And obviously, I think the Title 42, the public health restrictions, are the most tricky issue for this administration, because obviously there are real concerns related to COVID and processing. But we do also think there are ways that the administration can start to work to address those and to be able to process people even during COVID. So that's a huge issue. And I'll just mention also briefly on the southern border that another huge issue is, of course, the wall. And we are glad to see that Biden said that he will be not doing any more construction of the southern border wall. But obviously issues there remain about environmental destruction and sort of preventing future problems, as well as mitigating harms that have been caused by construction of the border wall.
And also another big issue on the southern border are separated families. And one thing that the Biden administration has done is to start a task force to try to figure out how to reunite those families. I heard just this morning that Michelle Brunet is going to head up that task force, which is great. But it is an arduous task, and it's going to take a lot of time. So there are a lot of problems, and just as Rome was not built in a day, so too the border wall is not going to be torn down in a day. Let's go back to you, Jorge. Something that Doris was talking about was how, because we didn't have enough legal immigration, some people were using asylum as a way to try to come into the United States. One thing that the Trump administration did do that the Biden administration has not undone are bans on certain immigrants and non-immigrants, and that has caused real problems. There is litigation on that, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about how those immigrant and non-immigrant travel bans are adversely affecting legal immigration, and maybe you could also point out how those bans differ from the Muslim and African country bans that the Biden administration has rescinded.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting state because a lot of these issues will tend to overlap, right? But the bans, again, in effect, are having the consequence of causing greater confusion and less ability for folks to enter legally, right? So folks that are trying to go through the process are finding that the ban and the security measures and the screening measures that were incorporated as part of these bans are actually holding up folks that would otherwise meet the criteria and should be coming in. And so we take the position of looking at what are all these things intended to do, and whether you're talking about the ones we just discussed on the southern border or even looking at these bans. Of course, there are measures that should be taken to ensure that we're protecting against anything or folks that may be intending to do the country harm. But by and large, closing it down or shutting it down is actually creating a much bigger consequence than what the country actually seeks to solve. And so whether you're looking at the asylum process, as we mentioned here, that the idea is not that the asylum process is broken, is that the other parts are broken, and the only legal avenue that many feel that they have available is to do the trek up to the southern border and try to use the asylum process to go in. It's not that we need to shut down the asylum process or fix that. We've got to fix the other parts and make sure that folks aren't even taking that trek to begin with, and that there's opportunities for the folks who are motivated to come to the country and work here and contribute here, have those channels available to them. And so you look at that not just in the asylum, but then you look at it in the bans as well, and you start to realize that the bans are having a much larger negative effect than what even the premise is. And even to the point made about the Title 42 restrictions, right? The whole premise of that, yes, there are health concerns and we should be concerned about those. But if the premise is economic and pretending that that somehow the immigrants that would be coming in are a threat to the American worker, when we know that the evidence clearly points to the fact that that creates more opportunities even for the American worker when we have immigrants coming and contributing, those fundamental basis reasoning of why these are even being taken into account need to be revisited and made sure that they are actually limited to the focus of what should be the concern and not having this much larger negative impact, particularly to the numbers of legal immigrants coming into the country.
Yeah, in another context, I've used an analogy to three legs of a stool. You can't just focus on one thing like asylum reform or legalization or enforcement. You need to have reforms in all three areas if you want immigration reform to actually work. And so we're seeing through the discussion right here how all of these things are interrelated, which also makes it more difficult for any administration to get us out of this mess. Let's turn next to DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And Keri, let me start with you. You worked on this when you were on the Hill working with Senator Menendez, and it's a big focus of your work at the Immigration Hub. One thing that President Biden did do the very first day of his administration was to come out with an executive order telling agencies to figure out ways to fortify and protect DACA, but that's not the end game. End game is to give them a path toward legalization. Senators Durbin and Graham announced last Friday that they would reintroduce their legislation. But what can the Biden administration do if Congress fails to enact a pathway to legalization for DACA recipients?
Yeah, so unfortunately, dreamers, people who've been here for decades and grew up in the United States, are still at the mercy of the courts and just waiting to see, what will happen with pending litigation right now on the DACA program. Because right now they still are able to apply and renew their status, but unfortunately there's a court case still moving forward that could take the program away. And so we're really concerned about this situation and hoping that Congress will move quickly to pass the DREAM Act, as well as protections for TPS and farm workers. But, if that were not to happen, which I really do hope it will, and I think we've got a good chance at passing DREAM either through regular order, just by getting Republican support, or through possibly reconciliation, which is a budget process that just requires Democrats to support it. But if that doesn't work, I do think there are other things the administration can do, trying to cover people through other programs, such as through TPS for individuals from certain countries, or through parole for certain individuals, maybe essential workers or other dreamers. So I think there'll be other things the administration can do, but really the youth have been here for such a long time, and it's really a horrible situation that they've been tossed around in the courts. So we're hoping we can get a permanent solution in Congress this year.
And Jorge, you've been very active on the DACA front. Why don't you tell us about some of the efforts that you've made over the last several years and what you're hoping that you might be able to achieve this year?
Yeah, I mean, it is one issue we've taken strong to heart and action, Steve. And it's also one that, just to be blunt, has created a lot of frustration, because it is the one issue that you talk to folks across the political aisle, to elected officials on either side, and they tell you that they want to get this done, and yet the politics and inaction on Congress continue to exist. And we don't, many folks forget that the first DREAM Act was actually introduced in 2001, and it's now been 2 decades since we've seen Congress actually solve or even get close to solving this issue. I would agree with what Keri has said. It is beyond the time to solve this issue so that dreamers are not just relying on court case decision to court case decision. I think we share the relief that many of the DACA recipients felt when the Biden administration came in and recommitted to keeping DACA, but that is simply not enough. They need and deserve a permanent solution. And so we've been focused on that. I think there is bipartisan support to get this done. I personally believe that it's important to try to do the bipartisan route that Keri mentioned, just because I think it could be the first step in growing momentum to then address other issues on immigration. And the less we make this a political decision, but actually one that shows where the American public is, which is, again, record 70-80+% of individuals wanting to solve this issue. It's just time for Congress to come together and solve it.
So Jorge, one thing I like to do in my webinars is action items for the audience. What can they take away from the webinar, not just understanding the issue better, but what can they actually do? What would you recommend that members of the audience do to try to motivate Congress to pass something on behalf of dreamers?
I mean, it's time to engage in a level that perhaps many have already undertaken, but that we still need and probably need more of right now. I would encourage folks to reach out to members of their delegation and their elected officials and call for both sides to work together. It is clear, again, from personal statements that elected officials have made to the public polling that shows support here, this can get done. And it's time for us to make sure that we're putting the pressure on elected officials. Right now, I would say, from what we're hearing, it is difficult. There's a lot of competing priorities at the moment. There's obviously the COVID pandemic, there's the economy, there's healthcare. But it's important for folks to know that the public wants and has support for a solution on Dreamers that has bipartisan engagement on it. And I think that part is important for the viewers today to know, that folks want to hear that part of get it done, work with folks across the aisle. We want to see this. There's a lot of appetite right now in DC for bipartisan solutions. And I think Dreamers is a ripe opportunity to actually get that done.
And one other thing, Keri, just to pick up on something you mentioned, the courts are also involved in this issue because, administratively, Biden can only do so much. And there is a court in Texas that is pondering a lawsuit by the state of Texas as to whether to declare the whole DACA program as illegal. So it puts more pressure on both the Biden administration and Congress to come up with a more permanent solution, since courts could strike it down. Let's move on to legalization. That's another key feature of any immigration reform. And let me start again with you, Keri. Certainly, if Congress were to pass something to legalize the estimated 10 million undocumented people in the United States, that would be a great legislative solution. What could the Biden administration do if Congress does fail to enact legalization?
Yeah, so Biden just put out his framework for reform and will be introducing bill text with Linda Sanchez and Bob Menendez next week, I believe. So that bill is a really great model with a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants. It addresses root causes of migration, reunites families, and protects workers. And so we're really hoping, that this will inspire Congress to move forward soon. But I think by the end of the year, if we have not seen progress in Congress, there will be a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to grant relief from deportation for individuals in the United States. There are so many people who've been here for decades. I mean, the vast majority of undocumented individuals have been here over 10 years. They have family members here. They work here. Many are essential workers. There are 5.5 million essential workers who are undocumented. So we're hoping that the Biden administration would look at using tools like parole in place for essential workers or additional deferred action programs, as well as really looking hard at temporary protected status. There are so many countries right now that are in horrible situations, like Cameroon, Northern Triangle countries, South Sudan, Venezuela. And so hopefully we'll see expansion of TPS to these countries and also redesignation of temporary protected status to countries that were covered under the Obama administration. So I think those are some of the tools they could use.
And Doris, on this issue, you and others at Migration Policy Institute just came out with a report last week on, what the size of the legalization population might be. Could you elaborate on the report and how you think that may affect the debate on this issue?
Well, yes, the large number of people that are eligible or that would be eligible under the proposal that Keri just explained and that the Biden administration is pushing is in the neighborhood of 11 million people. I mean, that's the size of the unauthorized population. That's a very large number of people. It's actually 1 in 4 of the foreign-born who live in the country at the present time. And so as legislators look at that, as compelling as the arguments are, that's a large number of people. And what we have been trying to do in the research that we do and have now published is explain the subgroups that exist within that population. The most well-known subgroup is the one, of course, that we've just been talking about, the DACA Dreamer population. And it certainly would be a great breakthrough for the Congress to act on that, and for the reasons that we've talked about, stabilize the circumstances of that population. But there are other populations that are within the 11 million that also have very strong equities. And they are, well, Keri mentioned the TPS population. There are about 320,000 people in the country that have been on TPS programs, temporary protected status, for more than 10 years. Situations in their countries are not improving. The essential workers phenomenon is the most recent phenomenon that comes about as a result of COVID that has led us to understand a great deal more about a subgroup within the unauthorized population. And those, of course, are workers who have been involved primarily where food is concerned, various aspects of agriculture and food service and delivery and grocery services, et cetera, as well as healthcare. Healthcare is heavily dominated as an occupation, all the way from physicians to home healthcare aides, disproportionately with people who are foreign born, and some substantial proportions don't have a legal status in this country. So it goes to the point of, how can you be an essential worker, but at the same time be deportable? I mean, that really is its own contradiction in terms. So what this work tries to do is lay out these subgroups with the hope that it will be informative for Congress, for members of Congress, to understand really who these people are. Some of these people, there's another major subgroup who are people that are the spouses of lawful permanent residents and U.S. citizens. They would otherwise be able to adjust their status under our legal immigration laws, except for barriers that were placed in the law in 1996 in a way that I referred to earlier. So Congress has a range of ways of being able to address parts of this population if the whole 11 million, which obviously would be the most desirable outcome, but if that is not politically attainable. And that's what we've tried to do with this work.
And to pick up on something that Keri mentioned before, is if Congress does fail to act, there are still options for the Biden administration to do things administratively. You talked about deferred action or other similar programs. They're all under the rubric of prosecutorial discretion, in that any immigration agency does not have the budget or the personnel to be able to deport all 11 million people without status in the United States. So we need to make decisions on which ones to prioritize. And Doris, I know in your tenure at the Immigration and Naturalization Service, you issued an important memo on prosecutorial discretion. And that's something that the Biden administration can do. And in fact, they already have tried to do it. They came out with a memo from DHS putting a 100-day pause on enforcement while they try to refigure what their priorities should be in deporting which individuals. But unfortunately, a court in Texas, at the instigation of the state of Texas, has put a halt on that halt. And so that reprioritization effort has been halted right now. So that's one of the problems that any administration has, is either Congress fails to act or courts step in, and it makes it very hard. Let's move on to the next slide.
Steve, let me
Sure.
can I just interrupt and make one
Please
comment
do.
on that? Because that aspect of prosecutorial discretion, I think, is really important in relation to what Keri talked about with the actions that an administration could take if legislation fails. Those actions, though, would be very controversial. I mean, a parole in place or deferred action for literally millions of people would be unprecedented. I think it probably would be challenged in the court. It's unclear whether it would survive. However, prosecutorial discretion, which is to say what it is that a new administration determines to be its enforcement priorities, can also provide an important protection. And that did take place at the end of the Obama administration. The guidelines for interior enforcement were very carefully refined, and work that we did at that time showed that 87% of the unauthorized population, in fact, was not subject to enforcement. So that's another tool that we need to keep in mind.
Great. And as we see on the slide now, moving on to other topics, one big issue is for those people who are in removal proceedings, How do we handle them? We have a huge backlog in immigration courts. And by immigration courts, I do not mean federal courts. I mean, these are judges who are employees of the Department of Justice, sort of like administrative law judges, and they handle individuals who are alleged to be deportable. And these individuals can either agree and be deported, or they may have some kind of relief, such as asylum. But we have a horrible backlog in our immigration court system. Doris and I and others are working on recommendations right now as to how to relieve the backlog, but over 1.3 million cases are currently backlogged with only about 550 immigration judges. And so it's a real problem. Doris, why don't you start with, your thinking as to how we might deal with this in terms of getting over that backlog to make our immigration courts run more smoothly?
Well, this is an enormous problem. It's an enormous bottleneck in the system, and it's very hard to fix. I do think that some of this, again, does go back to the Trump administration, because one of the things that happened during the Trump years was a series of decisions made by the Attorney General that severely limited the discretion of immigration judges to manage their dockets in ways that would determine which cases could be administratively closed as compared with cases that could go forward. A new Attorney General and a new administration could undo those decisions and at least give immigration judges more latitude. That would be important, and it would actually involve hundreds of thousands of cases. There are perhaps between 200,000 and 400,000 cases out of that 1.3 million where administrative closure and allowing judges to truly act as administrative judges would make a difference. But beyond that, it's a court system that is very out of date. It still operates entirely on paper files. There's very little modern technology. Court procedures in general take time, but there's a lot more that could be done. And so the budget and investing longer term in modernizing that court system is going to be incredibly important. And it may well be that there are cases, particularly in combination with changes made at the border to reopen asylum. It may well be that one of the best things that could happen in the immigration courts would be to create a different arrangement of dockets for priority treatment, so that an asylum system can be re-established that is in fact a fair system, but that is also timely. It simply does not make sense, and it is not viable for cases to wait 4, 5, 6 years in order to be decided. And that's what we have right now.
And Doris, not to put you on the spot, but I will. We have a question from the audience, and that is, would it be better if we made immigration courts independent of the Justice Department to have their own branch, what we call Article I courts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's, of course, a proposal that's been going around for a very long time. Independence is an extremely important issue with the immigration courts. There's a whole separate story about how that got left in the Department of Justice when the Department of Homeland Security was created. We've taken a look at Article I courts. It's a very popular recommendation, but frankly, Article I courts, the record with Article I courts is that they move even more slowly than administrative courts. Immigration courts are high volume operations. And so a better model for independence might be, and I'm not pronouncing entirely on this, I'm putting it out as an option, a possibly better model than an Article I court for immigration courts, given the nature of the cases, is something like the Social Security system has, or National Labor Relations Board. In other words, another administrative court structure, but free of a cabinet agency.
Great. Well, let's move on. There's a lot of other issues that we want to cover. Let's turn to refugees. In the Obama administration, the last year of the Obama administration, they wanted to bring in 125,000 refugees. President Trump cut that down to less than 15,000 the last year of his administration. And the Biden administration has vowed to try to bring that back up. Last week, they announced that they want to try to bring it back up, but it will take some time. I don't know if any of you, maybe I'll start with Keri, want to talk about, what do we have to do administratively to be able to bring in more refugees to the United States after the cuts that the Trump administration made to refugee resettlement agencies?
Yeah, the Trump administration really decimated the refugee resettlement system, which is really sad because there's so many communities across the United States who really have benefited from that program. But we do think that there is a legal possibility for the administration to work with Congress, as they're doing this week, to consult with them on raising the cap for refugee admissions. And we do believe ultimately they'll probably get to about 125,000 admissions. So that will really help the system to rebuild, just restarting the flow of refugees. And unfortunately, there's a pipeline. It takes a long time to vet refugees and have them go through the pipelines. So the sooner they get started, the better it will be for the system. But it is a relief that they can start looking at it now and not wait until October, which is the traditional time for the president to set the levels of refugees who will be admitted.
Great. Well, I want to make sure we stay on track. Let's turn to the next slide. There's a lot to be undone, but there's also a lot in terms of trying to imagine a better immigration system. So maybe I'll ask each of the panelists to sort of say, if you had to pick one thing to reform about our immigration system more than just undoing what Trump did, what would that be? And what is your prediction as to how long it might take to actually accomplish that? And we have on the slide here several ideas: legal immigration, legalization, enforcement, future flows. But you're not limited to those bullet points. So Jorge, why don't I start with you? What would be the one thing that you hope that does not exist in the current immigration system that we might exist by the end of the next 4 years?
So I would talk about future flows, Steve, because I think that's how we actually start to change the way and the pressures that are under the current system, is by thinking about how the country is going to start welcoming immigrants of tomorrow. That's not to say we should not focus on those who are here now. That's clearly, that status quo is not working for anyone. And I've agreed with what has been said largely on this panel up to now about the need to address the undocumented populations. But in 4 years from now, if we have not moved at all in terms of future flows and really finding ways to ensure that there are robust legal channels that folks can undertake, whether that is seeing the increase in numbers on refugees, truly taking a look at our non-immigrant and immigrant visas. I think one part that gets lost often is the ability to transition from a non-immigrant to an immigrant visa. There seems to be a really strict wall between those two, which to most people doesn't make a lot of sense. And so that's where I think, if in 4 years from now we haven't really started to talk about future flows, then all we're really doing is keeping the status quo, which keeps bringing pressure from on the back ends, which is not helping and is not really, no one is satisfied with the status quo. And so I would pick future flows from the list on the slide there.
Okay, and Jorge, follow-up question from an audience member is, how do we maximize the economic benefits of immigration and future flows while minimizing the negative impacts?
Sure. I mean, that's the key question, correct? Because no one is, at least I think here today, arguing that we don't need an immigration system and that America shouldn't be tracking or thinking about who comes in. But I would say, I think even in looking and I think what would be helpful is to make sure that folks are connected to what is that benefit, what is and what is that cost. By and large, immigrants are a net benefit to the country. They are coming in ready to apply their skills and contribute. They have high entrepreneurship rates. They create jobs and opportunities for others. Immigrants are not coming to abuse the system. By and large, they're here to contribute, to improve their lives. And in so doing so, they improve everyone's lives. And I think the narrative really needs to change. Immigrants aren't here to take from your piece of the pie. It literally grows the pie for America. And so Congress is going to have to do its job. It's going to have to sit down and talk about some of these costs and benefits. And at some point, I suspect that, of course, there's going to be an analysis of the numbers and the type of individuals. But I think we need to make sure that we're leaning towards this sense of American culture, which is to welcome immigrants, to encourage individuals who want to come here and breathe free. As you know, you've got the Statue of Liberty right up there on the slide. That's the important part, the basis of what the immigration system is even designed to do. It's designed to make sure that America is open and bringing in the future leaders and innovators of the world, or is it supposed to be some sort of security gate? And I would say it's the former, and that we've really got to be centered around that.
And in that regard, there was a study by the National Academies of Science in 2017 that did find that at a macro level, immigration was a net benefit to the United States.
That's right.
If people want to learn more about that, they can go to that study. Keri, let me turn it to you and put you on the spot. What are the one or two things you think are most important to reimagine immigration to benefit the United States?
Yeah, I think opening up ways for the undocumented to get legal status in the United States is our top priority. And really the flip side of that is also reforming our enforcement system, which targets so many people who've been here for so long and who are really want to become citizens, but there's just no mechanism for them to do so. And so we're really hopeful that we can make progress this year. It's one of the first years we really think that legislation is possible in many, many years. And so we'll work on that. And if not, then, I think Doris is right that ultimately the enforcement priorities are also incredibly critical. Even though there was a restraining order on the moratorium for deportations, there are still priorities that are in place. And so hopefully that will help to reform how ICE is engaging in enforcement such that we're not targeting people who don't pose any risk and who are long-term community members. So hopefully we can really make progress on those two areas in the next year.
And Doris, how about you?
Well, I'm also going to pick legalization. I totally agree with Jorge on future flows, and it's one of the things that concerns me a little bit about the Biden legislative proposal, that they definitely in the Biden legislative proposal are making more numbers available, but they're not really restructuring the legal immigration system in a way that allows for the kind of future flow patterns and policies that the country needs for demographic reasons and labor market reasons. But, bird in the hand. And so legalization for me is the bird in the hand at whatever scale it can be accomplished, because it's just so, it's the ultimate example of the failure and the failing of our immigration system, that we should be a nation of laws, but also a nation of immigrants that tolerates this level and number of people in the country without a legal status. And so it's those reasons, as well as just very pragmatic reasons, that people with a legal status are able to be upwardly mobile. They are going to pay more taxes. They are going to be able to move around the labor market. They are going to be able to contribute to the country, invest in their own education in ways that are very much not possible now. And there's also an element of this that I think is important where the functions of the government are concerned. And that is that the Department of Homeland Security and the immigration agencies in the Department of Homeland Security simply are not performing at a level that we should expect of our government. And some of that is due to the fact that they are charged with enforcing laws that don't make sense. They're enforcing laws that are not reflecting reality on the ground. Think of how demoralizing that is for immigration agencies. And we're at a point now where immigration connects to white supremacy. It connects to extremism in this country. We have got to have government agencies performing effectively and believing in our systems of government, including our immigration system. until we deal with this legalization issue, that's very hard to imagine from our enforcement agencies.
A question for both you, Doris, and for you, Keri, and that is related to that. Many people who are out of status and therefore deportable are because of the 1996 laws that made many more minor crimes situations in which someone became deportable. Is there any political appetite, Keri, for trying to roll back some of those 1996 laws regarding criminal conduct and their immigration consequences? And Doris, if Congress fails to act on this, I'll then ask you, is there something that the administration can do regarding that? Keri first.
Yeah, in the Biden proposal, there are some elements of the bill text that would help in this regard in terms of creating more discretion. We're in a system where judges don't get to look at the whole case. Their hands are tied. Someone's either deportable or even mandatorily deportable, and they can't really look at the whole circumstances of the case. And so I think there are proposals that are starting to gain steam, including in the Biden bill, that really would increase discretion. Of course, Congress is very polarized right now between Republicans and Democrats, and I think this is an idea that's gotten a lot of traction on the Democratic side in recent years due to advocates' work, but we have a long way to go in terms of Republicans. There are ways to do it, though, administratively as well, and so I'm hopeful the administration will look at, and I think they are looking at issues where like in terms of their enforcement priorities, looking at balancing, equities, reasons people should be able to stay in the U.S. and looking at how long ago the crime was committed, whether it was a serious crime, whether the person's now in a different stage of life, served their time and has kids and working and just in a completely different stage. So hopefully we'll be able to have more discretion in our process soon.
And Doris?
Yeah, I can't add a lot to that because Keri really has covered it. I mean, this should change this idea of aggravated felony in the 1996 Act is a term that applies only in the immigration context. There isn't any such thing as aggravated felony in other areas of criminal law, and it includes lots of things that would not. Don't fit under the minor drug crimes, a check cashing violation, etc. So it is really overbearing, and so as a matter of criminal justice reform, there is a very important immigration dimension in criminal justice reform that is reflected in that. But I think it's hard to see Congress acting on that, frankly, at least not. Congress will, I think, have to get its toe wet on a number of other immigration issues before it gets to that. And so basically it then is a question of the degree to which the enforcement priorities reflect some understanding of how unfair some of those can be.
Yeah, and let me just add one point to that, and then we'll turn it over to questions, and we can bring up the question slide now. And that is the public charge rule. We have not talked about that yet. And public charge is a concept in immigration law that says that if you rely too much on public benefits, you can then either be deemed not to be admissible to the United States, or you can be deported from the United States. And although that concept has been around since the 1880s, until the Trump administration, that concept was limited to people who relied primarily on certain cash benefits. The Trump administration, Doris, enlarged that concept through a rule that said now we're also going to consider receiving non-cash benefits and looking at a totality of the circumstances analysis. And that is something that the Biden administration could do if it wanted to try to undo the Trump administration, is could come out with another rule that would undo the Trump administration definition of public charge. There's also been litigation on this front, but the Supreme Court halted that litigation. Just wondered if you had any short comments on the public charge issue as a way to undo some of the damage from the Trump administration.
Well, yes, very briefly, I think that it is something that, again, was an overreach on the part of the Trump administration. The basic principle is a reasonable principle, but they stretched it to being entirely prospective, or not entirely, but They said that adjudicators needed to determine prospectively into the indeterminate future whether anybody ever might be reliant on benefits. That's an over-reading of the statute, and I think there's every reason to imagine, or not imagine. I think there's every reason to believe that the Biden administration will change that and return to the practices that were used post '96.
But it will take some time, unfortunately.
But it's a regulatory change, and it will need to be done correctly, especially because that would be very vulnerable to litigation.
Yeah. So we've got many questions from the audience, and you also see a link there to our handouts. An audience member asked, for example, where can I find out more information about what you've discussed here? And some of those handouts include that. Audience member also asked, how can I keep up on this issue? And there are a number of good sources. The Migration Policy Institute, for example, is a wealth of information about immigration, both including reports and regular newsletters. There's also the American Immigration Lawyers Association. There's National Immigration Forum. So there's a lot of way you can find out truth as opposed to misinformation on immigration. Jorge, going back to you, we had a question from someone about future flows, and that is, how do we determine what type of worker that we need? If we have labor shortages in certain industries, for example, how do we measure that to determine that we need more, say, healthcare, home aides, or whatever? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, but I'll start with the premise that I think it's safe to say that it is impossible to accurately predict that because our economy is dynamic. It moves at a much more rapid pace, and it's difficult to imagine that we would ignore the things that we don't even know could exist in the future. And we have got, America's design has been to open the door to those innovators because we know that we want to see what is unknown. Now, to the question that is posed, though, our immigration system has to be something that the American people trust. It has to be one that does take into account what our economy is currently doing. And we can look to different models as we reform our system that allow it to be dynamic as well, right? And so even our neighbors to the north, Canada has systems that allow for different economic indicators to play a role in the number of immigrants that the country will bring in. Increasingly, there's been support for ideas that even allow states to play a bigger role in this and have some say into the number of immigrants that perhaps could be brought in based upon the economic data that they're seeing even within their own states. And so they're definitely, it's not an easy number to come up with. There isn't a magical number that would solve for all this, but there are models and examples out there that can provide a blueprint for how our country, because U.S. would probably do it differently, but at least create a blueprint that we can look to know what are those economic indicators and how they can play a role in then allowing the immigration system to change the number of immigrants that come in every year.
And in that regard, here at Cornell Law School, we put out a report last July on looking to our neighbor to the north, Canada, and also to Australia about how they have a more dynamic immigration system, in part because they use a point system to try to evaluate a person's potential. And I would commend that report to people if they want to learn more about how we might adopt good practices from other countries to reform our immigration system. Doris, a question from the audience for you, and that's one thing we've not talked about yet, and that is backlogs in adjudications at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Agency. It's one thing that if you can apply for a legal visa or a green card, but it's currently taking the USCIS often 12 months or more to adjudicate these cases. So it's something that needs to be reformed if we want to have a functioning system. You dealt with this as Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, but your backlogs were a lot shorter. How would Mr. Mayorkas, as Director of Homeland Security, try to improve adjudication times at USCIS today?
Well, here, of course, we hearken back to changes that have been made over the last 4 years again. And that is that, among the hundreds of changes that were made are all kinds of technical directives. Some of them were regulations, some of them were policy memos, some of them were procedural changes. But they've added up to a great deal more paperwork, well, I shouldn't say paperwork, a great deal more procedural steps required in adjudicating. And of course, that reflected the view that immigration somehow serves as a threat to the country. And so there need to be more and more layers of effort put into determining legal immigration approvals. But interestingly, when you look at some of them, we looked at in particular at naturalization, even with a lot more procedure and therefore many, many more delays, the approval rates haven't changed that much. So if the approval rates haven't changed that much, even after all kinds of additional vetting, doubling the sizes of the numbers of pages on forms, et cetera, what are we really doing? And that, it seems to me, is very much a challenge, again, for the new administration, is to try to determine what is sufficient. Obviously, we need to have integrity in our immigration system, but it's gone overboard.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. There's a lot more that we could discuss, and I'm sure we'll continue the conversation in a variety of other ways. We thank the audience for participating today and learning about these important topics. If you want to learn more about what Cornell is doing on migrations generally, go to migrations.cornell.edu. And with that, thank you very much, and we hope to have another conversation in a year or two to see how much has changed based on our recommendations today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank